I'm going to give you a run-through of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I think your textbook's a little bit light on it, and it's important for you to understand the curves, what shifts them, and the effects once there's a shift on price, output, and unemployment. So I'm assuming you've read about aggregate demand and aggregate supply in your textbook, and I'm showing you here a curve which is aggregate demand. It shows you that it's equal to the sum of consumption plus planned investment plus government plus net exports. The thing that you have to remember is every time you see one of those aggregate demand curves, it's composed of the spending by the four sectors in the economy, and anything that changes that spending will shift the curve, either left or right. So obviously household spending is called consumption, business spending is investment, government spending is, dictated by the budget, and then there's net exports, which is exports minus imports. Now I'm going to be kind of switching back and forth from materials that I use in the classroom that are in a Word document and PowerPoint. But again, remember, aggregate demand is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. An increase obviously means a shift to the right, and that means at every given different price level, the demand for goods and services, or GDP, has increased. A decrease is a shift to the left. Remember, a rightward shift is always an increase, a leftward shift is always a decrease. Whenever you look at aggregate demand or supply, remember that word aggregate just means total, so we're talking about total demand, which is total spending, and supply, aggregate supply, that's the level of output. Now, I have a table. This is from a resource guide that I use in my on-campus classes, and I want to walk you through this table because I want all of you to understand this, because you have 12 extra credit questions on your second exam that ask you about what will increase and decrease aggregate demand, supply. So first of all, what this table shows is some of the things that will cause aggregate demand to increase or shift to the right. For example, expectations of future income, profits, wealth, or inflation. For example, if people have positive expectations for the future, maybe the economy is doing very well, they have a lot of job security, job stability, maybe they're expecting a raise, then they will increase their consumer spending today. Or businesses, on the other hand, again, if they have positive expectations for future sales, then they're going to increase their investment. If you and I expect prices are going to be rising in the future, today we might increase consumption and again cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Increased net exports is the next shifter. And increased net exports, how in the world do you increase net exports? Well, there's two ways. The U.S., if we were talking about the U.S., could increase its exports abroad, or it could decrease its imports. Either one of those or both causes net exports to rise, which causes aggregate demand to shift to the right. The next item that's mentioned is transfer payments increasing. Now, transfer payments increasing, what in the world are transfer payments? Well, that's money that is transferred usually from the government to us in the form of, could be welfare payments, it could be food stamps, it could be Social Security, retirement benefits, could be unemployment benefits. So if any of those rise, for example, in the last few years, we have increased the length of time that people can collect unemployment benefits. That is an increase in transfer payments, and that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, there's other types of transfer payments, but I'm speaking primarily of government transfer payments. Okay, businesses increase investment. Well, yeah, of course, if they spend more, an aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. The I is investment. So if investment goes up, then aggregate demand shifts to the right. So businesses increase investment. Well, what would cause them to do that? Maybe tax credits to business, positive expectations. You know, in macroeconomics, expectations is one of the most important economic variables that affects the economy. And so business expectations improve, so that'll increase investments. Households increase consumption. I think we've already talked about that, but again, anything that causes households to be more positive about the future will increase their consumer spending and shift aggregate demand to the right. Value of the U.S. dollar, meaning our exchange rate, if it falls, it'll cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Well, how does that work? Well, if the value of the U.S. dollar falls, that means our goods and services are cheaper abroad, and that will cause our U.S. exports to rise. So let me say that again. The value of our dollar falls, that means the price of U.S. goods is falling abroad, and we will increase our exports. Okay. Increased government spending? Yes, increased government spending. Government is one of the sectors of spending and aggregate demand. So any increase in government spending, it could be increasing benefits for education, it could be increasing defense spending, it could be new programs to clean the environment, retrofit bridges, education spending. Any increase in government spending shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now the last two that are mentioned, first one is increases of the money supply. You may have not have done monetary policy yet, but there is something I do expect you to know, and that is if the money supply increases, that will cause aggregate demand to increase. Well, why is that? If you have an increase in the supply of any product or service, then its price is going to fall. Well, what's the price of money? The price of money is interest. So if you increase the money supply, that means interest rates will fall. Well, if interest rates fall, then that means you and I will spend more, so consumption goes up. If interest rates fall, that means businesses will invest more because more projects will be profitable at lower rates of interest. So an increase in the money supply lowers interest rates and increases consumption and investment and shifts aggregate demand to the right. And then the last one that's mentioned is decreases in personal income tax rates. Well, if income tax rates go down, then people will have more disposable income. Having more disposable income, consumption will rise. So remember, these are the items, we went through this list, and these are just some of them, but they're main categories as well, of items that will cause the aggregate demand curve or total spending to increase or shift to the right. The opposite list, or the opposite column, the second column, shows a decrease. So obviously everything that we covered that increases aggregate demand, if you reverse it, it will decrease aggregate demand or shift it to the left. Okay, let's see where I'm going next here. I think I'll go back to my PowerPoints. Okay, you have hopefully read about the fact where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet is called equilibrium. It's short-run equilibrium. Oh, it just dawned on me. I haven't done aggregate supply. Let me go back to my Word document. Okay. Short-run aggregate supply, that's an upward sloping curve. It shows the positive relationship between the quantity of output demand or supplied and the price level. So just think of it as being output supplied at every different price. Again, the aggregate supply curve can increase, shift to the right, or it can decrease, shift to the left. So an increase means at every given price, or regardless of price, the supply of goods and services has risen or increased. Decrease means just the opposite. So think about it. This is regarding the production of output. What would cause businesses or business owners to be more willing to supply, regardless of price? And the one thing that I hope you think of is cost of doing business. So the primary cause of a shifting short-run aggregate supply curve, that's the upward sloping curve, is a change in the cost of doing business. So if the cost of doing business increase, then sellers are going to be less willing to supply, and they will decrease aggregate supply. If cost of doing business fall, things get cheaper to produce, the cost of inputs get cheaper, the cost of wages go down, then sellers will be more willing to supply, and aggregate supply will shift to the left, or sorry, to the right. So increase is a shift to the right, when costs of doing business fall. Okay, short-run equilibrium. This is where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are in balance and they meet. It's the equilibrium level of prices that are determined and the equilibrium level of output. And essentially, it occurs, as it says here, when total spending and total output are equal, meaning the consumption, investment, government, and net export spending is equal to the value of output and incomes that are produced. Now let me switch back to that PowerPoint. Short-run equilibrium, remember, is where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are in balance. Long-run equilibrium, well, now we've added this long-run supply curve to our model. I know that the long-run supply curve could get confusing for students. I've designated it YF, meaning the full employment level of output. It's the amount of output we're producing when we're operating on our PPC, efficiently using all of our resources. And your book, I believe, calls it the potential level of output. And full employment, potential level of output, they mean the same thing. So we're in long-run macro equilibrium when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal to the full employment level of output. So this long-run aggregate supply curve, which as I mentioned earlier is a bit confusing, it's like a yardstick or a marker to tell you where the full employment level of output is. In this case, you can see it on the graph. It doesn't have a value, but we could say that it might be 15 billion in output for the U.S., or 15,000 billion, meaning $15 trillion. But the problem is that equilibrium, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are in balance, may be greater than or less than full employment. We want it, the goal is that they are equal at full employment, but it can be at less than or greater than. So number one, if aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, meaning they're in balance, but they're at less than full employment, that is called a recessionary gap. Again, at less than full employment, that means they would intersect to the left of full employment. That's a recessionary gap. Or we could have aggregate supply equal aggregate demand at greater than full employment. Well, at greater than full employment, that is an expansionary gap. Now, I do want to go back to my resource guide for a moment and talk about the things that will shift the aggregate supply curve. I think I omitted that, so. Okay, now this gets kind of ugly, I know. I have to redo this, but anyway, for now we're going to live with it. This is showing the long run and the short run aggregate supply curve shifting at the same time to the right. This is an increase. This graph is showing the long run and the short run decreasing or shifting to the left. Both are decreasing. So you need to be familiar with what will shift both the long run and the short run. Now, we did the short run all by itself, and remember, that's changes in the cost of doing business. Now, what will shift both of them together? The long run and the short run always shift together. They both either decrease or they both either increase. Now, in the real world, it's not happening, simultaneously. It's in a series over time, series of shifts over time. But if I tell you what causes an increase in long run and short run aggregate supply is the same thing that shifts out the PPC, I hope you would know some of the factors that would cause an increase in both of those supply curves. So, again, the short run aggregate supply and the long run both increase when anything causes the PPC to shift outward. For example, we have more people in the labor force. We have more investment into physical capital or human capital. Workers are more productive. Capital equipment is more productive. There's a technological advancement. There's a positive climate change that makes our land more productive. All of those things would cause both the short run and the long run aggregate supply to increase because it shifts out our PPC. It makes that potential amount or full employment amount of output larger. If anything, obviously decreases those, smaller labor force, less physical capital or less quantity of physical capital. The level of human capital declines, meaning people have less knowledge and skills. Productivity lessens, technology declining, or we have some kind of a natural disaster like Mount St. Helens, Katrina. I remember quite a few years ago, we had terrible fires in Laguna Canyon, followed by subsequent flooding. Those things shift the production possibilities curve to the left. That means aggregate supply long run and short run both decrease. The reason they both decrease is because we have less resources, so we're able to produce less output, and we also have a higher cost of doing business, so that's what causes the short run to also shift. All right, so to summarize it, when cost of doing business rises, the aggregate supply curve shifts left or decreases. When cost of doing business fall, the aggregate supply curve shifts right or increases. Any factor that shifts the PPC outward causes the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve to increase. It lowers the cost of doing business, shifts them both right. Any factor that shifts the PPC inward causes us to be able to produce less output. It raises the cost of doing business, and it shifts the AS and LRAS inward. So, let's see, this goes on, This goes on to talk about that long-run equilibrium condition. We've spoken about that. And now, and this might be helpful for you to see. Again, when total spending and total output are in balance but are less than full employment, it's a recessionary gap. When total spending and total output are equal but it's more than full employment, then it's called an expansionary or inflationary gap. Okay, I'm going to switch back now to my PowerPoint slides, and we're going to talk about some of these shifts. I need to look at my time here. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoints. Okay, first of all, we've got pictured an increase in aggregate demand. A new aggregate demand curve shifted to the right. Now, let's talk about what can cause that. First thing, improved expectations. positive expectations for the future. That means consumers will spend more, consumption rises. Businesses will spend more, investment rises. We could have lower rates of interest, meaning the money supply is increased, interest rates have fallen. Consumption goes up, investment goes up. Government spending, they increase transfer payments for education, more spending on education, aggregate demand increases. Then let's use our net exports. We could increase our exports, we could decrease our imports, and this would happen when the value of the dollar falls, and that will cause aggregate demand to increase. Now, most important, when aggregate demand increases, the average level of prices rises, the level of output rises, and unemployment falls. I know you can't measure the change in unemployment here, but it's implied with what happens to output. If output is rising, then we must have more workers employed, and that means unemployment must be falling. I think I'm going to stop this recording now, and then I'll pick it up in the second recording to give you a walkthrough of these graphs.